For my 21st birthday, my grandmother left me her $50 million hotel empire. Then, my mother showed up with her new husband and told me they were taking over as a family, until Grandma's final surprise turned their smiles into panic. The study still smelled like her. Lemon oil on old wood, and underneath that, faintly, the rosewater perfume she'd worn every day since before I was born. I was sitting in my grandmother's leather chair, behind her enormous mahogany desk, holding her reading glasses in both hands like they might still be warm. It had been 9 days since the funeral. 9 days since I'd watched them lower Margaret Calloway Pierce into the ground in the Pierce family plot outside Charlottesville, in soil that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. I heard the front door before I heard the voices. It didn't open so much as it slammed, the old brass knocker rattling against the frame, and then heels on hardwood, fast and certain, the kind of footsteps that expect the world to clear a path. "Where is she?" My mother's voice rang through the downstairs hall. "Vivian? Vivian, where are you?" I set the glasses down on the blotter, carefully, the way Grandma always set things down, like every object deserved a moment of respect before you let it go. Then I stood up, just as the study door swung open without a knock. My mother, Diane Pierce Whitlock, stood in the doorway in a cream blazer that probably cost more than the entire month's grocery budget I'd lived on during architecture school. Behind her was a man I recognized from exactly 2 photographs on her phone. Tall, silver at the temples, wearing a navy suit that fit him the way suits fit men who'd never once worried about rent. Trent Ashworth, her husband of 4 months, my stepfather, technically, though the word felt absurd in my mouth. "There you are," my mother said, scanning the study the way you'd scan a listing you were thinking of buying. Her eyes moved across the bookshelves, the framed blueprints on the wall, the antique globe Grandma kept by the window, because she said a person who built things needed to remember how big the world actually was. "We need to talk about the company." "Hello to you too, Mom." She didn't catch the edge in it, or she didn't care. Trent stepped past her into the room, and I watched him do the same inventory she'd just done, eyes flicking from the crown molding to the original hardwood to the brass fixtures, like he was already mentally drawing up a renovation budget. "Vivian," he said, extending a hand I didn't take, "I know this is a difficult time. I want you to know Diane and I are here to help carry the weight. As a family, we're taking over the day-to-day," my mother said, and she said it the way you'd announce dinner plans. Casual, already decided. Trent has run companies before, real companies. He's going to step in as interim president until things stabilize, and I'll handle the family side of things. The optics, the press. We thought it'd be easier on you if you didn't have to deal with all of it. You just graduated, sweetheart. You should be enjoying your 21st birthday, not buried in spreadsheets. I looked at the calendar on Grandma's desk. It was, in fact, my birthday. I had forgotten entirely. "I appreciate the concern," I said slowly, "but I don't think that's how this works." "Vivian," my mother's voice sharpened, just slightly. The warning tone I'd known my whole life, the one that meant I was supposed to fall in line now. "The will reading isn't even until Thursday. We're not trying to steamroll you. We're trying to keep Calloway Pierce hospitality from falling apart while the lawyers do their lawyer things. Someone has to be making decisions." "I've been making decisions," I said. "I've been running the renovation division for 2 years. I know this company." Trent smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Running a renovation budget is not the same as running a 40-property hospitality group, Vivian. No offense intended. It's a different scale of thinking entirely." "None taken," I said, though I felt my jaw tighten. "We've already spoken with the board," my mother said, informally. "They understand the family wants continuity. Trent's going to bring in some outside consultants, modernize a few things that, frankly, your grandmother let go stale. The Ivy Hollow property alone is sitting on land worth more as a sale than it's ever made as an inn." Something cold moved through my chest. The Ivy Hollow Inn was where it had all started. The first property, the one Grandma bought in 1971 with a loan no bank wanted to give a 26-year-old widow, the one she'd scrubbed the floors of herself for the first 3 years because she couldn't afford staff. "You're not selling Ivy Hollow," I said. "That's not your decision to make yet," my mother said. And there it was, the truth under all the cream blazer politeness. Yet, not your decision yet, which meant she was already planning for the day it would be someone's decision, and she didn't mean mine. "Get out of her office," I said quietly. My mother blinked. "Excuse me, this is Grandma's study. You don't get to walk in here 9 days after her funeral and start measuring the curtains." Trent put a hand on my mother's shoulder, the picture of calm reasonableness. "We'll let you have your space tonight, Vivian. We just wanted you to hear it from us first, before Thursday, so it doesn't come as a shock at the reading." He paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I'd later understand was pity, the specific pity reserved for people you've already decided have lost. "Try to get some rest. Big day ahead." The door clicked shut behind them. I sat back down in Grandma's chair and didn't move for a long time. To understand what was happening in that study, you have to understand who Margaret Calloway Pierce actually was, because the version my mother grew up resenting and the version I grew up loving were somehow the exact same woman. She was born in 1947 in a tobacco farming family outside Lynchburg, Virginia, the kind of family that measured wealth in acreage and debt in equal parts. She married young to a man named Robert Pierce and was widowed at 24 when he died in a logging accident, leaving her with a baby daughter, my mother, and almost nothing else. The story she told told me, more times than I could count, was about the morning after the funeral when she sat at her kitchen table with $11 and a stack of unpaid bills and decided simply that she was done being poor. She took a loan no one wanted to give her, secured against a falling down 10-room farmhouse near Ivy Hollow that the bank considered worthless, and turned it into a bed and breakfast. She did the books at midnight by lamplight. She cooked breakfast for guests at 6 in the morning and cleaned rooms by 9, and a loan officer named Walter Higgs once told her, to her face, that a woman alone had no business running a hospitality property, and she ought to sell it back to him for a fraction of what she owed. She thanked him for his time. Then she walked across the street to his competitor and got the financing to build a second wing. 18 years later, she put Walter Higgs's bank out of business by buying the building it had occupied and turning it into her fourth property. By the time I was old enough to understand any of this, Callaway Pierce Hospitality owned 41 boutique inns and small luxury hotels across Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, each one restored rather than rebuilt, each one carrying some piece of regional history Grandma refused to let developers flatten. The company was worth, by the last valuation I'd seen, just over $52 million. My mother grew up inside that climb and despised every inch of it. She told me once, the only time she was honest with me about it, that she remembered being 9 years old and watching her mother fall asleep at the kitchen table with a pencil still in her hand, and deciding right then that she would never work that hard for anything because look what it had cost. What she wanted instead was the result without the decades, the money without the mortar. She tried modeling. She tried 2 failed boutiques of her own, both funded by Grandma, both folded within 2 years. She married 3 times before Trent, and each time Grandma quietly paid for the wedding and, eventually, quietly paid for the lawyers. What Grandma never did, not once in 50 years, was give my mother a job inside the company. Your mother sees the inns as a faucet, Grandma told me once when I was 19, and we were walking the grounds of the Ivy Hollow property together, her hand resting light on my arm the way it did in her last few years. She has never once asked me how a single one of them was built, only how much they're worth. She stopped walking and looked at me very directly. You ask how things are built, Vivian. That is the whole difference between you and her. Don't ever lose that. I'd spent every summer since I was 16 working underneath her, starting in housekeeping, then the front desk, then 2 years ago moving into the architectural restoration division, where I oversaw the structural renovations on 6 properties myself, working with contractors twice my age who'd stopped questioning my hard hat the day they saw my markups on a load-bearing wall nobody else had caught. I had an architecture degree from the University of Virginia, finished 4 months ago, and I had assumed, the way you assume the ground under your feet, that I had years left to learn the rest of the business at Grandma's side. I did not know, sitting in her study that night after my mother and Trent left, that Grandma had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 14 months earlier and had told almost no one. I did not know she'd spent those 14 months quietly rewriting things. Thursday came too fast. The reading was held at the offices of Holloway and Briggs, the law firm that had represented Grandma since before I was born, on the 3rd floor of a converted tobacco warehouse downtown that smelled like old paper and furniture polish. My mother arrived in white, an actual white pantsuit, which struck me as either an extraordinary failure of self-awareness or a very deliberate statement. I still don't know which. Trent sat beside her in navy, checking his watch twice before we'd even taken our seats. I sat alone in the back, in the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral, because it was the only thing I owned that felt like it understood the room. Walter Briggs, the firm's senior partner, had been Grandma's attorney for 31 years. He was a small, precise man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and when he finally cleared his throat to begin, the room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. He moved through the smaller bequests first: a scholarship endowment to the hospitality program at Virginia Tech, a sum to her longtime housekeeper, Odessa Marsh, who'd been with her 34 years, a donation of her personal art collection to the Charlottesville Historical Society. My mother's foot was tapping against the carpet, faster with every line that wasn't the one she was waiting for. And now, Mr. Briggs said, setting down one document and lifting another, we come to the primary asset of the estate, namely 100% of the issued and outstanding shares of Callaway Pierce Hospitality, LLC, and all controlling interest in its subsidiaries and real property holdings. My mother went very still. Per the final amended will of Margaret Callaway Pierce, executed and notarized 11 weeks ago, I am to read the following statement into record. He looked up briefly, then back down at the page. To my granddaughter, Vivian Pierce Callaway, I leave the entirety of Callaway Pierce Hospitality, free and clear, to manage, grow, or dispose of entirely at her own discretion, as she alone sees fit. The silence afterward had a texture to it, thick enough to touch. Trent's pen, an expensive one, the kind with weight to it, slipped out of his fingers and rolled off the conference table onto the floor. Nobody picked it up. That's not possible, my mother said, and her voice had lost every ounce of its earlier polish. That has to be a mistake. I'm her only child. I assure you, Mrs. Whitlock, Mr. Briggs said, not unkindly, your mother was of entirely sound mind when this document was executed. Her physician and 2 independent witnesses were present. This will is, as we say, ironclad. 11 weeks ago, my mother repeated, and I watched her do the math in real time. watched her face shift as she landed on the answer. 11 weeks ago was 4 weeks after her wedding to Trent. She rewrote it after she met him. I couldn't speak to her motivations, Mr. Briggs said, though something in the set of his mouth told me he absolutely could have and had simply chosen the lawyerly path of not volunteering it. My mother stood up so fast, her chair scraped backward and nearly tipped. This is insane. She built this company with my father's name on the deed. I am owed half of this at the absolute minimum. This is elder manipulation. This girl has been living in that house for 2 years, whispering in her ear, manipulating a sick old woman. Linda, Trent said, low, a warning, his hand closing around her wrist. Don't you Linda me, my mother snapped, before catching herself, before remembering the room full of witnesses and forcing her voice back down into something more controlled, more dangerous. She turned to look at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. Her eyes were not sad. They were calculating. We'll see about this, she said. She and Trent left without another word, the door swinging shut hard enough to rattle the glass in the frame. I sat there afterward, alone with Mr. Briggs, my hands shaking in my lap. Miss Calloway, he said gently, using the surname Grandma had asked be added to the documents, the surname that tied me back to her directly. Your grandmother asked me to give you something, privately. Once the will was read, she was very specific that it not happen in front of your mother. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a single sheet in Grandma's looping handwriting. Vivian, if you're reading this, then they have already come for you, or they're about to. I know my daughter. I know what she married. There is more in the safe at the house than just this letter. Trust Odessa. Trust the numbers. And never ever let anyone make you feel like ownership is something you have to apologize for. I love you. Now go run my company. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant reading that letter. I didn't. I felt terrified. I was 21 years old. I owned $52 million in hotel real estate. I had no legal experience managing, and I had just watched my own mother look at me like I was something she intended to dismantle. It took exactly 6 days for me to understand how right Grandma had been. I drove to the corporate offices in downtown Charlottesville the following Monday in my best blazer, my employee badge clipped to my lapel, and swiped my keycard at the glass entrance the way I had 100 times before. The reader flashed red. Access denied. I tried again. Red. A security guard I didn't recognize stepped out of the booth, polite but firm. Can I help you, miss? My badge isn't reading. I'm Vivian Calloway. I work in the renovation division. Well, I own the company, actually. I just need to get up to the 10th floor. He glanced at a printed list on his clipboard, frowned, and said the words that would replay in my head for days afterward. I don't see a Vivian Calloway on the active personnel list. I'm going to need to call up and confirm. I stood in that lobby, in the building my grandmother had built from the original Pierce farmhouse loan 50 years earlier, and waited like a stranger while the guard phoned up to ask permission for me to enter my own company. When he hung up, his face had gone carefully blank, in that way people's faces go when they've been told something they don't agree with but aren't paid enough to argue about. Mr. Ashworth's office said you're cleared to come up. 10th floor. Mr. Ashworth's office, not the president's office, not my grandmother's office, his. The elevator doors opened onto a floor I barely recognized. Grandma's reception area had always been warm, dark wood paneling, a soft green carpet, framed black and white photographs of the original Ivy Hollow Inn, under construction in 1971. All of it was gone, replaced with white walls, polished concrete flooring, and a young receptionist at a glass desk who didn't look up from her monitor when I approached. I'm here to see Trent, I said. He's in a strategy session. You can wait. I didn't wait. I walked past her desk toward the double doors at the end of the hall, the doors to what had been Grandma's office for 3 decades, and pushed them open. The room had been gutted. Her oak partner's desk, the one she'd bought secondhand in 1974 and refused to ever replace, was gone. In its place sat an enormous glass desk, and behind it, in what I'd later learn was a $6,000 chair, sat Trent on a call, one finger raised toward me in a gesture that meant, wait. My mother sat on a leather sofa against the wall, scrolling her phone, wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, and an expression of someone settling comfortably into ownership of something that was never hers. They're redecorating, I said, out loud, to no one, my voice flat with disbelief. My mother looked up. Oh, don't be dramatic, Vivian. That old furniture was falling apart. Trent had it moved to storage. It's fine. Trent ended his call and folded his hands on the glass desk, the desk where Grandma's hands had once rested for 30 years. Vivian, he said, with the particular warmth of a man delivering bad news he's decided to enjoy. Glad you stopped by. We were actually going to call you this week. This is my office, I said. I'm the owner. I'm in charge. Sweetheart, he said, and I felt my whole body go rigid at the word. Ownership and operational control are two separate things in any properly structured company. You own the shares. That's wonderful. Congratulations. You're a very wealthy young woman. But the board appoints leadership, and as of this morning, the board consists of myself, your mother, and our new CFO, a man named Garrett Voss, formerly of one of my old portfolio companies. The vote to install me as president was unanimous. There is no board without me, I said. I'm the majority shareholder. You weren't present for the vote, Trent said smoothly. We did try to reach you. I looked at my mother. She was smiling, actually smiling. The small, satisfied smile of someone who has finally, after 50 years of watching her own mother build something without her, found a side door into the building. I left without another word. word, because I knew, somewhere underneath the fury, that arguing in that room would accomplish nothing. I drove back to the house that night, the Pierce family home outside Ivy Hollow, where Grandma had lived for 40 years, and I sat in her empty study until almost 2 in the morning, staring at the dark, trying to remember her letter. Trust Odessa. Trust the numbers. Odessa Marsh had worked for my grandmother since 1990. She found me in the study close to midnight, still in my work clothes, and didn't ask what was wrong, because she already knew. Your grandmother told me this would happen, she said, setting down a cup of chamomile tea I didn't ask for and wouldn't drink. She told me, the week before she passed, that if her daughter ever brought a husband sniffing around this company, I was to bring you to the safe in the cellar. She didn't trust phones, didn't trust emails, said paper can't be hacked. The safe, hidden behind a false panel in the wine cellar Grandma had built into the house decades earlier, held what amounted to an arsenal. There was a flash drive labeled in Grandma's handwriting in case of theft. There was a sealed copy of an addendum to the company's operating agreement, one Mr. Briggs had drafted and notarized 11 weeks before her death, the same week as the will. And there was a single page, typed, outlining something Grandma called the continuity clause. The flash drive held a video, recorded from her hospital bed 2 days after my mother's wedding to Trent, her voice thin, but her eyes sharp as ever. Vivian, if you're watching this, they've come for the company already, or they're about to. I want you to know, I saw exactly who Trent Ashworth was the first hour I met him. I have spent 50 years learning to read men like that. He's not a businessman. He is the appraiser, looking for what he can flip. Your mother is the door he's using to get in. I am not leaving you defenseless. Look at the operating agreement addendum. Look at the clause Walter Briggs drafted. It is a detonator. Vivian, do not use it until you are ready to end this entirely. The addendum, when I finally read it line by line at 3 in the morning with Odessa sitting beside me at the kitchen table, contained a single provision Grandma and Mr. Briggs had built specifically into the company's governing documents. It stated that no removal or appointment of executive leadership and no transfer, sale, or encumbrance of any property held by Callaway Pierce Hospitality was valid without the notarized written consent of the majority shareholder. Any action taken in violation of that clause would be considered void from inception, and full operational and financial control would immediately and automatically revert to the majority shareholder, meaning me, along with the right to remove and replace any board member installed in violation of the clause. Trent's board vote had been illegal from the moment it happened. He simply hadn't known the clause existed because Grandma had never told him. The forensic accountant Mr. Briggs brought in within the week, a quiet, exacting woman named Carol Inwen, found what I'd already suspected, and worse. In the 11 days since Trent had installed himself as president, he had attempted to transfer the deed of the Ivy Hollow Inn, the original property, the one with my grandmother's entire life built into its foundations, to a shell entity registered in Delaware under an address that traced back to one of Trent's former business partners for a sale price of $1. He had wired $410,000 from the company's operating account into a personal account under the label consulting retainer. He had fired 6 longtime managers, including the Ivy Hollow property's general manager of 22 years, and replaced them with people from his own previous failed consulting firm. My mother, the records showed, had received a wire transfer of $150,000 from Trent's personal account 4 days after the illegal board vote. Memo line listed simply as gift. I called the board meeting myself the following Monday morning, with Mr. Briggs and Carol Inwen seated beside me, and copies of the notarized addendum printed and ready. I walked into the same glass office, past the same receptionist who tried briefly to stop me, and into the boardroom where Trent was midway through a presentation titled Callaway Pierce 2.0, complete with renderings of Ivy Hollow rebuilt as a glass and steel boutique resort. Every trace of the original 1880s farmhouse erased from the design. I unplugged his laptop from the projector cable and replaced it with my own. The clause appeared on the screen in plain black text, large enough for every member of the actual original board to read from their seats. Walter Higgs's grandson, ironically enough, sat among them now, a longtime investor who had nothing to do with the long-ago slight against Grandma, but everything to do with recognizing fraud when it was projected in front of him. "This is fabricated," Trent said, his voice climbing half an octave. "She wasn't of sound mind. This girl manipulated a dying woman. The notarization is dated and witnessed," Mr. Briggs said calmly, sliding copies down the table. "Your appointment as president, Mr. Ashworth, was void the moment it occurred. Every transaction you have executed since is similarly void, and several of them, including the attempted transfer of the Ivy Hollow property for $1, constitute fraud under Virginia law." My mother stood up so fast, her chair nearly toppled. "You did this," she said to me, her voice shaking with a rage I'd genuinely never seen from her before, not even close. "You ungrateful little. After everything you did," I said quietly, "was take $150,000 from a man who tried to sell Grandma's first hotel for $1. I have the wire transfer, Mom. I have all of them." She went white. Trent reached for her arm and she yanked it away. The board voted unanimously to remove Trent effective immediately and to reinstate every employee he had terminated. Security escorted him from the building within the hour. My mother left on her own, but not before turning back at the door to look at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Something between hatred and the specific grief of watching a door close that she had genuinely believed would always be open to her. What followed was not, contrary to every instinct I had at 21, a clean victory lap. It was 11 weeks of forensic accounting, of rehiring staff who'd been let go, of personally calling vendors Trent had stiffed and apologizing on behalf of a company that bore my family's name. Garrett Voss, the CFO Trent had installed, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge, and his testimony, combined with Carol Inwood's audit, gave prosecutors what they needed to charge Trent with multiple counts of wire fraud and attempted property fraud under Virginia code. Charges that, given the size of the attempted theft, carry the real possibility of significant prison time pending trial next spring. My mother was never criminally charged. The wire transfer wasn't on its own enough to prove she'd known what Trent was doing, even though every instinct in my body told me otherwise. But Grandma, it turned out, had thought of that too. Buried in the will's final clause, one Mr. Briggs read aloud during a follow-up hearing months later, was a provision stating that any family member found to have accepted funds derived from fraudulent activity against the estate would forfeit any remaining trust or stipend Grandma had separately left them. My mother had a modest trust, untouched by the main inheritance, meant to keep her comfortable for the rest of her life, regardless of what happened with the company. The accepted wire transfer, documented and undeniable, triggered the clause. The trust was dissolved by court order 4 months later. My mother moved to Florida that summer. She has not spoken to me since the hearing where it was finalized. I think about calling her sometimes, late at night. The way you think about touching a stove you already know is hot. And then I remember the smile on her face in that glass office, the one that said she'd finally found her way into a house her mother had spent 50 years building and locking against her. And I put the phone back down. I moved back into Grandma's actual office 4 months ago. I had Trent's glass desk hauled out the same week the verdict on the property fraud charge came down, and I had her oak partner's desk brought back from storage, scuffed and imperfect and exactly right. I had the continuity clause, the one that saved everything, printed and framed, and it hangs on the wall across from where I sit now, so that I see it every single morning before I open my laptop. Ivy Hollow Inn was never sold. It's open today, fully restored. Its general manager of 22 years back, behind the same front desk Trent had emptied. I drove out there myself 2 weeks ago, late in the evening, and stood in the lobby breathing in cedar polish and old wood, the same smell that's been there since 1971, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was drowning in something too big for me. I felt like her granddaughter. She didn't just leave me a company. She left me a fortress built years in advance, board clause by board clause, witness by witness, because she had read Trent Ashworth's character in a single dinner, and had spent the rest of her short remaining time making absolutely certain he could never take what wasn't his. She taught me, my whole life, how buildings stand. In the end, the lesson that mattered most was about something that doesn't show up on any blueprint at all.